For over 100 years, Iowa State University Extension and Outreach has been serving Iowans. As our state recovers from COVID-19, we will continue to deliver information and education based on research to help you care for your family, manage stress, and support your community, your business, and your farm. We're here for you now, and we will be for the next 100 years. Together, we will build a strong Iowa.
Hello. I was doing a little waiting to see when I was going to end up, so hopefully that's on screen. Welcome to today's Tips from an Expert. I am Leah Feltz, and I'm a social media specialist with Iowa State Extension and Outreach. And today I am so excited to have our special guest, Sean Schaus. Hi, Sean.
Hi, Leah.
How are you today?
I'm doing great, thank you. And you?
I am doing well. I am anxious to learn from you today because you are not normally, I am not normally involved in harvest. So I'm going to learn a lot from you. We just had our video producer on screen for a moment. I got distracted by Jed's nice face there. So yeah, we're going to just jump into some content. Before we get going, I always want to make sure that we put our Iowa Concern in front of everyone. This is a free resource available 24/7 for all Iowans. Anything that you are facing right now, you can give Iowa Concern a call and they will have resources for you. They'll be able to connect you with local resources, places that you can receive further support, help, whatever it is you need. Iowa Concern is there for you. And it's one of my favorite things that we offer through Iowa State Extension Outreach. Obviously, outside of you, you're my favorite resource, Iowa State Extension. All right, so this week is National Farm Safety and Health Week. So it is a perfect time to have you on talking about Harvest 2020 challenges and the safety. I mean, this year's crazy, Sean. This year has just, whew.
Yeah, that's right. If there's anything different that could happen, it's happening this year, isn't it?
Exactly. It is one of those ones where every time you think, okay, we've got our feet under us, then something new comes along. So yeah, I'm going to hand it over to you. You can go, you've got some great information to share today on the challenges and some safety concerns, just some really good resources. And as you talk, just as a reminder, if as you are listening in to Sean sharing this information, a couple things. If you have any questions, ask Sean. He knows a lot of things. It's actually astounding. So maybe there's just a random one you want to throw in there just to test his knowledge base. Also, I'm going to be putting links in the comments. So as he's talking and mentioning resources, those will be popping up in the comments. That way, whether you're watching now or coming back later to kind of get some information, you can still easily access all of these resources. So, all right, Sean, it is you.
Okay, thanks, Leah. Yeah, there's some phrase about jack of all trades, but I can't think of the last part of that now, so we'll skip past that. The reason I'm on today is because it is part of my role. I work with farmers about ag safety issues, and safety is always an issue in agriculture. It's one of the nation's most dangerous occupations, and especially during harvest season, just because of the time constraints and the rush to get through things, we have extra safety issues at harvest time. Grain handling, harvesting, storing, drying grain is part of the expertise that I help provide with Iowa State University. So we'll talk a little bit about some handling issues and drying and storage issues with this year's grain. And machinery and tillage, those kinds of issues also come into my bucket as we're working in the extension. So that's why I'm going to try to cover a variety of different harvest-related topics today. We'll start off with just 3 general safety tips that yield big dividends here. So 3 things I would like to encourage farmers to think about. It helps if you know your harvest equipment. And this is something, harvest equipment has evolved over the years. It gets more complex, in some ways easier to operate, but in many ways more difficult to understand. And when things are going smoothly, the harvest equipment may run beautifully without much trouble. But we know that this year is an unusual year, so it will pay to know your equipment better than average this year, to know how it's going to react and respond to the different conditions you're going to be facing this year, and to know how to make the machinery do what you need it to do in an unusual year and keep yourself safe in the process. When we talk about safety with harvest equipment, one of the primary things is entanglement, getting caught in the equipment. Because harvesting equipment is made for gathering in the crop, it is very aggressive, especially on the front end of the machine, because that's what it's made to do, is to grab things and pull them into the machine very rapidly. So this year in particular, because of the way the crop has been tangled by wind, there are going to be some issues with getting the crop into the machine, and we know that it's going to plug up more frequently than it does in a normal year. And when you do have to get out and unplug that gathering end of the machine, that head, that is a very, very hazardous situation. So make sure that everybody understands how to be safe when it's necessary to get out there and pull a plug out of the gathering equipment on the front end of that combine. There are ways to make that more safe as you're doing it, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. The other thing I want to mention is just being proactive when it comes to slips and falls. While the gathering equipment may pose the threat of something that can dismember you and kill you very quickly, actually, when you look at the number of injuries that happen in the fall, slips and falls are right at the top of the list. So more people get injured just by slipping and falling during harvest than by anything else. So here, think about why we would slip and fall more easily. There's a lot of climbing on and off equipment during harvest. So it's a lot of trips up and down ladders and stairs. And if it happens to rain a little bit during harvest, which it usually does in Iowa, your feet are going to be muddy. Those things can get slippery, and it just makes a real hazardous situation. Plus, when you're working extra long hours, you get fatigued. And when you're a little bit tired, your feet just don't quite make it to the step as accurately as they would when you're refreshed first thing in the morning. So all those things come together just to make slips and falls, whether it's getting on and off a tractor, a combine, going up the ladder or stairs to check a grain bin. All of those climbing things that we do can lead to injuries. So keep that in mind as well. Clean those steps off more frequently. Make sure that you knock some of the mud off of your feet before you start climbing, and take your time. Make sure you've got good footing. Beyond that, then, let's look a little more closely at those combines. I've got some combine adjustment tips here. We know that this year, especially if your fields have some down corn or some lodged corn, it's going to be a slower harvest than usual this year. So be prepared for that. Mentally, just accept the fact that this is going to take longer than it does normally. Fortunately, we'll be able to start on it in a relatively normal time here. It's not going to be a late start to harvest like it was last year, but it is going to be a slow harvest. So be prepared for that, and make sure everyone else that you're working with for this harvest understands that as well, that it's just going to be slow, and you have to just take that pace as part of what's necessary this year. We'll want to start harvest as soon as it's practical. What I mean by that is watch the conditions in the field, watch the condition of the crop, the moisture content, and whether there's any mold growth that's rapidly increasing in the crop, whether the stalks in the cornfield are standing well, or whether their condition is getting questionable and you expect more down corn to happen as you get wind during the coming weeks. And then judge, where do I start? Which field should I start with? How soon should I start? Can I dry this grain down to storage moisture contents rapidly enough to keep up with harvest? Those kinds of things to make sure that you know when to start harvest. But this would not be a good year to wait. We know that because of the conditions we had this summer, there's a lot of crop that was drought affected. That's going to affect the quality of the corn and make it harder to harvest and dry and store than normal. So those things come into play when deciding how soon you start the harvest. Operating the head on that gathering end of the machine as low as you can to get under those lodged stalks will help to pick them up and get them into the machine, so you're leaving as few ears out there on the ground as possible. Having said that, also look at the quality of that corn that's down there closest to the ground. That corn was susceptible to a lot of splash of water and soil that would carry molds up onto the ears. If that gets to be too bad a quality down there right next to the ground, there may be some of those ears that you'd just as soon not be able to get into the harvesting machine. So you'll have to do a little bit of scouting around the field and see what the conditions are there. But keeping that head low and going slow is going to help you to pick up those lodged stalks and get those stalks and ears up into the machine. Just expect, as we said earlier, that plugging is going to happen. It's just comes along with conditions like we have in most cornfields in Iowa this year. So knowing that that's going to happen, try to plan to make that as easy to manage as possible. If you know that plugging is going to happen, be ready to do the right thing to help get those plugs back out of the machine. So going a little bit slower and stopping sooner. If you think that the machine is just about to plug, stop sooner than you would normally. Don't wait and see if that slug will work its way through the machine. Just go ahead and stop the machine, wait for things to clear, and try to prevent some of that plugging from happening in the first place. The sooner you stop, the more likely it is you'll be able to use the reversing function on the head to back that plug out, so that you don't have to physically go out there and pull those jammed stalks out of the gathering mechanism. When plugging does occur, then make sure you follow all the proper safety procedures. Lift the head up, put the stops in place so there's no chance of the head coming back down. Turn the machine completely off and put the key in your pocket as you go out there and work on that machine to make sure there's absolutely no chance of anyone inadvertently starting the machine up while you're down there around those aggressive gathering components on the head. So go through all those safety checks, make sure you're doing things as safely as you can, even though we know that takes a few extra moments to do it all the right way. It takes a lot less time than recovering from an accidental injury that would happen. And if you have a field that's in particularly bad shape, it may be a year that you'd want to make use of either a grain platform for corn harvest, or at least some of the add-ons that can be purchased, a reel to help pull those stalks up into the gathering chains and snapping rolls, or the snout cones that help pull the stalks up over the snouts and work them back into the head of the machine. All those things can help to get that tangled down corn up and into the head so that you're fighting it less with the machine operation. May be necessary in some cases if the corn is leaned in the direction of the rows to travel only one direction, harvest against the lean of those corn stalks. If they're leaned across the rows, it may just mean slowing down and giving the machine time to get those stalks pulled back up and over the snouts and into the head. So all those kinds of things are going to be necessary this year. There's a lot more information available on these types of adjustments and considerations on the Integrated Crop Management blog and news. And Leah will have links to those resources here coming up. So also, when we look beyond just the harvesting of this down corn and think more about managing the down corn, we have 3 tips here for all grain growers to look at. Before you begin harvest, make sure you have talked to your crop insurance adjuster if you have wind damage in that field. Don't make any assumptions here about what you should or shouldn't do for that insurance adjustment. So be in contact with them, make sure you know what their expectations are, if there are any test strips you need to leave, if there are any checks for grain quality that need to be done before you get into harvest full bore, all those kinds of things. You don't want to do something here that's going to compromise your ability to work with that crop insurance in the end. So make sure that you're in communication with that adjuster and know what the requirements and expectations are, and share with them what conditions you're seeing as you scout in preparation for harvesting that field. Go out there and scout the field. Look for the condition of the grain that's standing. Look at what the condition of the grain is that's down close to the ground, where we expect to see more problems. You'll be looking for things like mold growth on that corn, because the mold growth can cause storability issues and marketing option issues for the grain. Also, in some cases, that mold growth can lead to mycotoxins that may affect the end usability of that grain for different markets. So those you need to be checking for and trying to determine before you get into harvest what you're going to be dealing with. May affect where you can go with that grain, how much of that you want to try to pick up off the ground, and what the end use could be for that grain. Test weight is another thing you'll want to be looking at, because that can affect the salability of the grain, and certainly will affect how well it would store if you're trying to store that grain on farm. The test of the grain, make sure you do that. If you're going to be feeding the grain to livestock, you'll need to know if there are any mycotoxins or molds there that would affect the end feed use for that grain. There are many resources available that will tell you for different types of mold what the associated mycotoxin could be, what the levels are that are acceptable for feeding different species of livestock. Earlier in the year, when we had a lot of drought impact to crops, that was favorable for aflatoxin formation in the grain in the field. So that certainly is a concern where drought impacted the crop, as well as wind damage, perhaps. Later on here, we've had conditions that may be favorable to the molds that produce vomitoxin. So those are a couple, aflatoxin and vomitoxin, are a couple that we will certainly want to be watching for this year in the grain that's been impacted by drought and by wind damage. So beyond that then, let's look at harvesting that moldy grain. 5 tips for taking care of that moldy grain in the field. Again, start by communicating with your insurance adjuster. The key thing here is that if they make an insurance adjustment for mold on the grain, that adjustment has to be made while the grain is still in the field. Once it's in the grain bin or sent off for marketing, you can't have the insurance adjustment for that mold damage. So the best thing to do is to harvest just enough to get a good sample from the grain tank of the combine. It's that way you're sampling just what you can pick up with the combine, but you've left the majority of the crop there in the field for an adjustment if you find something that looks like it's going to be an issue. If you decide then that it's okay to go ahead and harvest, you've got the insurance side of things covered, then you'll want to get that grain dried as soon as possible after harvest. We know this grain is not going to store well, and particularly if it's not dried down adequately for storage in the field, you'll want to finish drying that as soon as possible. What we mean by that is don't rely on low temperature natural air drying systems that require weeks of airflow to finish drying that grain. You'll want to use heated air drying and get this dried immediately when it goes before it goes into storage or when it goes into storage. So this is going to be a difficult year. Hopefully the grain moisture contents will continue to come down so we won't have to pull as many points of moisture out of this corn, but we'll need to get it dried quickly. Any damage that we do to the kernels, because we expect them to be lighter test weight and softer kernels, they will damage easily. So be aware of that and handle this grain as gently as you can to prevent additional damage that opens the kernel up for more mold attack and damage to happen in storage. And when you harvest, handle, and store this grain, keep it separate from the higher quality grain. We would always say that you should never put new grain in the same bin with old grain. And this year, you'll want to make sure that if you have grain that you know has mold issues, that you do your best to keep that separate from the grain that is higher quality. You don't want to cause mold growth to happen in higher quality grain by mixing in some low quality grain. So to the extent that you can, separate those and store them separately to prevent future problems in storage from happening. So that kind of covers the harvest side of things, what we think we're going to see, and some tips on how to manage around an unusual year like this with lots of grain damage, lower quality coming in, and challenges just on the timeliness and safety of harvesting. Let's talk a little bit about farm families, though. When you talk about farm safety, one of the things we really want to do is protect children and younger members of the family who are involved in farming operations. Here are a few tips to think about ahead of harvest here and have in place before we get into the heat of the harvest season. If you've got play areas on the farm, designate where those safe play areas are that are separated from the traffic and machinery that's associated with harvest. Make sure that children are either contained in an area that's safe or know at least where that safe area to play is, and that other areas are off limits for them. If you've got other areas there that you know would be particularly attractive to children, if it's not possible to physically separate those, then at least identify what those are and make sure the children understand that these are not areas that are allowable for their playtime. It's a hard thing for children to do. If something looks like fun, really hard to stop them from going out there to try to experience it. So look for what those areas might be and try to make those as inaccessible as possible to the children. And if that's not possible, make sure they understand that you do not want them in those areas. Identify other dangers with children, especially here we're thinking older children who might be able to do some kinds of help with the farming operation. Identify where there are particular hazards and dangers that you just want them to stay clear of. There are certain tasks that they may be able to help with or observe safely while you're working. But if there are areas that you know are particularly hazardous that you just want them to stay away from, talk to them about that. Make sure they understand where those areas are, what's okay to be involved in or observing, and what is simply off the table, out of bounds for them during this particularly hazardous time of year. Something that is maybe easy to say and very difficult to do is to model safe practices. We all know that children, what is it I've heard it said, children rarely do what you say, but rarely fail to do what you do. They watch what we do. We know that. And so they will do the same kinds of things that they see you doing. So be particularly aware of that and model good behavior. If you're telling them to slow down, be careful, use proper safety procedures, if they see you ignoring those kinds of rules, they take that to heart and they want to do what you do more than that they want to listen to the safety advice. So be aware of that. Model good procedures and practices out there so that they learn safe procedures by watching you. And then review all of these same kinds of safety issues with anyone who comes to visit the farm. Those of you who are there may have talked about these things, but if cousins, relatives, friends come for a day, make sure that you have that same talk with them so that they have the benefit of your same safety advice, so that they don't walk into something hazardous by accident here. And reviewing this with the whole family is always a good thing. Having all the safety numbers, contact numbers for safety equipment providers, for emergency responders, all of those things readily accessible, stored in cell phones, posted by landline phones. Seconds count when there is an accident. So make sure that you've got all those things spelled out, clearly labeled, and everyone understands what to do if there is an accident and you need help there on the farm. So that's for the farm side of things, but we know that farm safety doesn't just involve farmers. It involves people who are working and traveling around farms as well. So let's talk about some road safety tips here. This is for all the rest of us who are sharing this space with farmers right now. This is something that's a big deal. We have a lot of roadway accidents, and particularly during harvest season, because this is when we have the most road traffic of farm equipment on Iowa roadways. So a few safety tips here. Number one, may be really obvious, but slow down right away. When you come up behind farm equipment, don't wait to slow down until you get really close to them. As soon as you see that they're ahead of you, begin that process of slowing down. That's only going to cost you a few seconds in your trip and can greatly reduce the chance that you will come up on them faster than you thought you were going to and have a rear-end collision. The weight of these machines is tremendous, many, many times more weight than your car has. So you can imagine if you ram into them, you're not going to speed them up much. You're going to slow down to their speed. It's not going to be an even match between the two speeds. So slow down right away when you come up behind folks. And then be patient and wait for an opportunity to pass. Even if you follow for a couple of miles at their 20-mile-an-hour speed, that only costs you a couple of minutes in your trip. So keep that in mind. Keep a little perspective here that following at a slow speed until you've got a clear area to pass is not really a big deal. It seems so annoying, I know, but it really doesn't cost you that much time. Don't take chances and try to pass when the visibility isn't suitable for that. Also, when you are passing, make sure that you get far enough over to get around that equipment safely. A lot of these machines are wider than you think. Iowa law says that they have to be able to yield half of the roadway width so that other motorists can pass. But that just simply isn't possible with some of the equipment that gets moved on roadways. So watch very closely for those markers at the outer edges. There should be reflective markers or lights out there at the extreme edges, but don't count on that. Wait until you can actually see where the edge of the equipment is as you're passing, and watch very closely for that. That's another reason to wait for a really good place to pass, because you may have to pull over quite a ways to get around some of this wide equipment. When you're watching this farm equipment, also watch for left-hand turns. This is one of the most common after rear-end collision. This would be the second most common type of accident with farm machinery. You're following behind them. You finally get to a place where you've got visibility to pass. You pull out and start to pass, and suddenly they turn left and cut you off. So watch for that. If you're going to pass, look ahead and see if there's a farmstead, a driveway, a field driveway, something like that on the left side that they may suddenly turn into. Anticipate that they could be turning if you see someplace where it looks possible. Be aware, too, that they may pull over slightly to the right to make a wider turn to the left. So just because they start to ease over to the right doesn't mean necessarily they're inviting you to pass. It may be in preparation to turn left, and you just have to watch for that closely. A lot of this newest equipment will have turn signals, but many of the older pieces don't have turn signals to show when they're going to turn. And then along with harvest, as if farm machinery congestion on the road wasn't enough of an issue, this is also the time of year when the deer move around a lot. So watch for deer as well. They can make a mess of a car and put you in the ditch just as easily as another motor vehicle or farm equipment can. So watch out for that. A lot of things just to watch for. The deer, I think, would have to have a wildlife specialist to confirm this, but I think they do tend to move around more right about dusk. And so that's a time when visibility is starting to get poor. And the deer are moving, a lot of people on the road going home from work, and those kinds of things just all add up to be extra challenges right around that time of day. So watch for that as well. So that kind of wraps up some tips on different areas of farm safety and what we expect for harvest this year. A list of resources is here on the screen. A lot of these are on the Integrated Crop Management website under their storm damage resources, and a lot of different types of information there. So if you go to the listing for Iowa State University's Integrated Crop Management, you'll find all kinds of references and resources related to harvest safety, harvest conditions, harvest equipment, all the kinds of things that we touched on very briefly here today. And along with that, you'll also see references back to, as Leah mentioned, the stress that comes with a particularly challenging harvest, and people who can help you deal with that stress, who understand the kinds of things that you're going through. And this is something we really want folks to take to heart. Even if it's not you yourself who is feeling tremendous stress, have this number handy. If you know someone that you can see that stress is starting to impact and affect, we all get through this better when we take care of each other. So if you know someone who seems like it's getting to them, be ready to help them reach out and get the help they need to manage this. We'll get through this, but it's going to be a challenge this year. With that, I think I'll see what kind of questions maybe have come up, and I'll let Leah kind of walk us through that.
Absolutely. I knew I was going to learn a lot, and I did. First off, I want to just draw attention back to the comments. If you have any questions or just even something that you found interesting or a resource you've used that maybe we didn't discuss, you're welcome to drop those in the comment section. I have quite a few comment or links available. So just wanting to draw attention to a few of them. First off, for National Farm Safety and Health Week, we do have the link in the comments that'll take you to the resource page where they've actually got some great webinars from specialists across our country as we're all celebrating this week. And then things that Sean talked about, harvest, safety yielding big dividends. There's more information on that. The grain quality because of this extreme weather. So again, just all of the topics that you hit on today, as Sean talked, I tried to drop those in. So if you're watching this later after the live's over, you're going to notice these comments popping up right as he's talking about that. And I wish it was I wish I could say it was magic because it sounds much cooler, but it's not. It's just me clicking back here. So, and just like you were just saying, Sean, I loved that. We will get through this. We will. But it's not easy right now. It is extremely hard. And we're seeing a lot of families under stress that no generation before them has had. We're seeing drought. We're seeing extreme weather. We're also doing all of that during a pandemic. So these are things that, maybe have been experienced at times before. But man, altogether, this is really, this is 2020. Wow. One thing that we were talking about prior to the live, we talked about how farming families, it is such a family operation. You have generations that are all looping in to support each other. And I know one that I've heard in our community is how grandparents are typically helping, and that due to the pandemic and trying to social distance and trying to keep those that might have pre-existing conditions as safe as we can, that they've run into just some lack of support on the farms. Are you hearing that from from specialists you're working with? Is that going on? Is that all over? Are we all experiencing this?
Yes, that's a really good point. In addition to some of the price stress that has been added by the pandemic and disruptions in supply chains, just that aspect of some of the folks you maybe would have called upon to help during harvest may or may not be available because of the pandemic and the health concerns. So if you were relying on grandparents or retired folks in the community to help out, they may have health concerns that prohibit them from being in contact with outsiders unless they were already working with them prior to harvest. If you normally would reach out to a neighbor, say, hey, we're going to be a little late getting out of the field here. Can you go pick up the kids from daycare or from school? Can you run them to this event? That may or may not be possible under the pandemic conditions. So excellent point to be thinking about that ahead of time here, figure out what your options will be, and recognize that you may just not have as many options available to you as you did in a normal year.
Yeah. So I did add to the comment section, and I'm throwing it up here so people can see it. But some of our human science specialists did put together a few publications that talk about childcare considerations because of this pandemic. And one of the resources that I actually found very helpful in the circumstance that I'm living in right now with my family is it talks about like carpooling and just precautions to take. So like you mentioned, if you are having a friend or someone pick up your kids and drop them off, you can do that safely while still keeping considerations and best practices and, disinfecting and all of those things. But yeah, it's, one thing I love about our extension resources is that we are research-based. So someone else has made sure that this is a trusted research-based resource. Again, that information is in the comment section as well. So one thing I just want to say to you, Sean, is I want to say thank you to you, and I'm going to have you represent all of our ag specialists. So make sure, send the love. But man, we are depending on you guys in a way that, we haven't always had to. I mean, our specialists, our ag specialists are always phenomenal, especially during these harvest and busy grow times. But man, this year you guys have gone over and above. Do you want to talk about the tillage webinar? Just give a brief overview of those unharvestable corn. Was that the title?
Yes.
It's a new word, unharvestable. It always underlines when I type it, but I'll drop a link. But if you want to give a brief overview of that, that's a great tool.
Sure. We know that in the worst of the derecho impact area, there is some corn that just is so flat, it's not going to be possible to pick it up with the equipment that we have available. And so in those cases where the insurance adjustment says this is a total loss, it's unharvestable, we're thinking ahead to how do we manage that for next year then? This is a great amount of crop residue and the grain on the ground. How are we going to get this ready for next year? So they took some equipment out. A couple of really sharp thinking ag engineers on campus said, we need some answers and we need them quick here to help people decide what they should do with this ground this fall. So they rounded up, with the help of some generous equipment suppliers, several different pieces of equipment, and took them out on one of these fields and tried running them across the field. The goals here are twofold. Number one, we want to get that crop residue, the corn stalks, sized, we call it, sizing that residue, chopping it into shorter lengths. Number one, so that it will break down somewhat over the winter and allow the recycling of those nutrients into the soil. Number two, so that it will be possible to get a planter through that next year. If we just leave those long stalks laying there on the field surface, they're going to decompose slowly, and they're probably going to be too thick a mat on the surface of the ground to get a planter through. So they wanted to see, what does it take to get that chopped up and sized appropriately? The second part of that is there's a lot of ears of corn laying there on the ground. When you do the calculations, the math of how many kernels of corn is that, what population of corn would that make if it even a tenth of it sprouted and grew next spring, it's a scary number. The amount of volunteer corn that would be present in the field next year could be horrendous. So we would also like to have as much of that grain, if it has to be left on the ground surface, we'd like to have that off of the cob, sprouted and growing this fall so that it kills over the winter, and we don't have as much of it trying to grow next spring and be a problem in next year's crop. So looking at those two aspects, they tried several pieces of machinery. They have some nice video of their operation of that machinery and the comments from the experts on how well they think different types of machinery worked. Excellent resource for anyone who has some of that down corn, unharvestable corn that they need to deal with and prepare for next year.
Yeah. So I did put the link to that webinar in the comments, and that webinar is located on our Agricultural and Natural Resources YouTube page, which has a plethora of other videos. And I know they've even created some shorter 4 or 5 minute ones that talk about the volunteer corn. I saw the volunteer corn. It was a 4-minute video, and the title is Volunteer Corn, and then it says, in parentheses, it says, thanks to Rachel. And I think that's I like that title. Yeah. We're having to put so many resources out there because of this massive storm that we're starting to get a little snarky with our titles, and I enjoy that. All right. Well, we have put a lot of resources in the comments. You've shared such great information and done it in a way where it's digestible. We can do this. Thank you again for covering some of those safety thoughts for families. That's very valuable to me, thinking of my kids, even visiting a farm, having those things in mind, making sure I'm having that conversation with, the parents of that that own that farm, and what are things that they should or should be. Just lots of thoughts there. And continue to follow us on our Facebook pages, and I also listed some other social media platforms that you can follow for up-to-date information regarding crops and other ag areas. So Sean, this is his email address. I kind of hope you get inundated with emails and questions, because I hope people are excited about what we have to offer and the fact that you're not alone. We've got specialists here all over Iowa that are doing work so that you can have a trusted place to ask your questions. So again, write his email down, write Sean's email down, and then also make sure to jot down the Iowa Concern number. And again, Sean, you said this earlier, and I loved it. If not for you, you might need it for someone else. You might realize that there's someone in your life that seems to be carrying a little bit more than they should be, and reaching out and finding some resources that could support them and what they're facing. You will never be upset that somebody checked on you. You will never be upset if someone is just saying, "Hey, I found something that might help." And this could be for farming families, but you certainly don't have to be a farming family. Iowa Concern is for everyone, for wherever you're at. So, Sean, thank you so much. I value this time, and I know your time is precious right now. It is a busy, busy season for you. So thank you for taking time to share with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for hosting again. Wonderful to get the word out in every way we can.
Absolutely. All right. Well, guys, if you're watching this later, even after the live is over, still drop your questions in the comments, or just let Sean know he did a great job. And we'll make sure to forward that on. If you've got questions, we'll find you answers. You guys all have a very good day.